Did you leave your brain at home, old man? The voice, sharp and laced with the brittle confidence of youth, crackled over the Coast Guard cutter's hailer. Do you even know what a restricted zone is, old-timer? On the deck of the Wanderer, a small, salt-bleached fishing boat that looked as if it had been carved from driftwood in memory. Silas Croft didn't flinch. At 82, his movements were deliberate, economical. He continued mending a small tear in his net, his gnarled fingers working the twine with a familiarity that transcended thought. He knew this channel better than the lines on his own weathered hands. He knew the tides, the currents, and the invisible lines drawn on naval charts that young men with loud voices and gleaming white ships were sent to enforce. A young cadet barely out of his teens stood at the rail of the cutter, hands on his hips in a posture of practiced authority. His name was Miller, and the crisp newness of his uniform was an affront to the timeless, weathered world of the old fisherman. "Sir, I need you to answer me. You are in violation of Naval Exclusion Zone regulations." Silas looked up. His eyes, the pale blue of a winter sky, held no fear, no anger, only a deep and abiding calm. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Well, are you going to move your vessel or not?" Miller pressed, his voice rising in pitch. He glanced back at his own commanding officer, a lieutenant who watched the exchange with a neutral expression, allowing the cadet to take the lead. It was a training exercise, a chance for Miller to cut his teeth. A second guardsman, older and more seasoned, leaned toward the lieutenant. "Sir, maybe we should just give him a warning. That's salty Silas. He's been fishing these waters since before the base was expanded. Regulations are regulations, petty officer," the lieutenant said, his voice just loud enough for Miller to overhear and feel validated. "Cadet Miller, proceed." Bolstered, Miller puffed out his chest. "Sir, I am ordering you to present your vessel's documentation and your personal identification." Now, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, Silas set down his net. He moved with a stiff grace, his body a chronicle of hard-lived years. He shuffled to the small, cramped wheelhouse of the Wanderer and retrieved a worn leather wallet and a plastic-sleeved binder of papers. The whole process took nearly a minute, a span of time that stretched Miller's patience to its breaking point. "Let's pick up the pace, Grandpa," he shouted, the insult echoing across the water. On the nearby public pier, a small crowd of tourists and locals had begun to gather, drawn by the sight of the gleaming cutter looming over the tiny fishing boat. The cutter maneuvered closer, its wake rocking the Wanderer aggressively. Miller and the petty officer boarded the small vessel, their polished black boots looking alien on the worn, fish-stained deck. Miller snatched the documents from Silas's outstretched hand, flipping through them with a dismissive air. "The Wanderer," Miller sneered, reading the name off the registration. "Looks more like the sinker. When was the last time this relic was properly inspected?" Silas didn't answer. His gaze was distant, fixed on the gray naval destroyer docked at the far end of the pier. He seemed to be listening to a sound no one else could hear, a low hum that vibrated deep in his bones. Miller, irritated by the old man's silence, began his own impromptu inspection. He prodded at the hull with the toe of his boot. He pointed out a patch of peeling paint. He ran a gloved finger over a rusty cleat. Every observation was delivered with a tone of condescending superiority, meant to humiliate. "This vessel is a hazard," Miller declared loudly, playing to his superior on the cutter. "The wiring for these navigation lights looks frayed. The fire extinguisher is, what is this, from the Stone Age?" He held up the small, faded red cylinder. "I could write you up for a dozen violations right now." The crowd on the pier was growing restless. Murmurs rippled through them. They saw what Miller saw, a tired old man on a tired old boat. But they also saw what Miller, in his youthful arrogance, could not, the quiet, unshakable dignity of Silas Croft. They saw a man being bullied for the crime of being old, of being slow, of owning something that wasn't new and shiny. "What's your problem, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Miller's face was inches from Silas's. "You think you're above the law? You think because you're old you can just float wherever you please?" Silas's pale eyes finally focused on the cadet. There was no anger in them, only a profound, weary sadness. "No, son," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I just know where I am." The simplicity of the statement seemed to enrage Miller further. It felt like mockery. "And I'm telling you where you can't be. I'm starting to think you're not all there. Maybe you're confused. We might have to escort you back to shore for your own safety." His superior, the lieutenant, finally intervened, though not in the way one might hope. "Cadet, check the helm. Ensure all equipment is up to code. Be thorough." It wasn't a de-escalation. It was an authorization to continue the harassment under the guise of official procedure. Miller grinned and pushed past Silas into the tiny wheelhouse. It was cramped, smelling of diesel and old coffee. Charts were neatly rolled and stored in a tube. A pair of binoculars sat on the dashboard, and there, bolted to the wooden console next to the ship's wheel, was a piece of metal. It was a jagged, twisted shard, about the size of a man's hand, its surface pitted and discolored by ancient heat. It looked like a piece of junk, a random bit of scrap someone had inexplicably decided to mount in a place of honor. Miller tapped it with his knuckle. It made a dull, heavy sound. "What's this piece of crap for?" "Good luck charm?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. He reached out, his fingers tracing the warped edge of the metal. "You know, this is a safety hazard. Sharp edges. I could make you remove it." As Miller's fingers touched the shard, the world seemed to tilt for a moment. The gentle rocking of the Wanderer vanished, replaced by a violent, gut-wrenching lurch. The smell of brine and diesel was incinerated by the acrid stench of jet fuel and burning electronics. The quiet afternoon was shattered by the deafening, soul-shaking roar of a turbine engine screaming its death throes, punctuated by the frantic shouts of men in a smoke-filled, red-lit compartment. Fire. Fire in the CIC. Brace for impact. The jagged piece of metal in Silas's wheelhouse was no longer cold and inert. In this fleeting vision, it glowed a malevolent, cherry red, a fresh wound torn from the very heart of a warship. It was a fragment from an incoming missile, a harbinger of chaos and flame that Silas had met once before, a lifetime ago. The vision was gone in a heartbeat, leaving only the quiet bobbing of the boat and the smirking face of the cadet, oblivious to the ghost of thunder he had just awakened. On the pier, a man named Peterson watched the scene through a pair of bird-watching binoculars, his knuckles white. He was a retired Navy chief petty officer, and he had recognized Silas from the moment the cutter had pulled alongside. He'd also recognized the faded insignia on Silas's worn ball cap, the silhouette of a destroyer, the USS Starkweather. Peterson felt a hot, protective anger rising in his chest. He saw Miller's obnoxious posturing, the way he boarded the Wanderer as if he were storming a pirate vessel, the relentless, petty humiliation of a man who deserved nothing but respect. Peterson had seen enough. He lowered his binoculars and fumbled for his cell phone, his fingers thick with indignation. He didn't dial 911. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he hadn't used in years but had saved for an occasion he hoped would never come. It was the direct line to the Command Master Chief of the naval base. The phone was answered on the second ring, CMC's office. "Chief, it's Peterson. Retired. From the kid," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're not going to believe this. I'm down at the public pier. The Coast Guard has got Silas Croft cornered out by the breakwater." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Say again, Peterson. Who did you say they have?" "Silas Croft," Peterson repeated, putting a heavy emphasis on the name. "Yes, that's Silas Croft. A young cadet is on his boat right now, treating him like a common criminal. He's calling his boat a piece of junk, threatening to impound it. He's about to put his hands on him, Chief. You need to get someone down here. Now, the man is a living legend, and this kid is spitting on his shadow." The Command Master Chief's voice changed instantly, shedding its administrative tone and taking on the sharp edge of command. "Where exactly are you, Peterson? Stay on the line, I'm on my way." Peterson relayed the exact location, his eyes still fixed on the drama unfolding on the water. The witness had made the call. The gears of a vast and powerful machine were beginning to turn. For Cadet Miller, the lesson was already on its way, approaching at flank speed. Inside the sprawling administration building of Naval Base Coronado, Command Master Chief Hector Vargas strode through the halls with a purpose that made junior officers flatten themselves against the bulkheads. He didn't slow his pace as he burst into the office of the base commander, Captain Ava Rostova. She was on a conference call, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Ma'am, we have a situation," Vargas said, foregoing all protocol. His tone alone made Rostova end her call immediately. "What is it, Master Chief?" "I just got a call from a retired CPO on the public pier. The Coast Guard has a vessel stopped in the channel just outside the breakwater. A cadet is harassing the occupant." Rostova's expression was impatient. "The Coast Guard has jurisdiction there, Hector. Is there a reason this requires my personal attention?" "Yes, ma'am," Vargas said, his voice grim. "The occupant of the boat. It's Silas Croft." The name hung in the air-conditioned silence of the office. Captain Rostova's entire demeanor shifted. The administrator vanished, replaced by the warrior. Her eyes, which had been tired from a day of bureaucratic battles, were suddenly sharp and clear. She swiveled in her chair and typed the name into her secure terminal. A file appeared on the screen, flagged with commendations and a level of clearance that made her sit up straighter. She read for a moment, her eyes widening slightly. "My God," she whispered. She looked up at Vargas, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Get me the Admiral's aide, now." Then get a detail ready. Full dress whites, and I want our 2 fastest patrol boats at the command dock in 5 minutes. I'll be leading them myself." "Aye, ma'am," Vargas said, already turning to leave. And Master Chief Rostova called after him. "Find out the name of that Coast Guard cutter and the commanding officer of that cadet. I want them." Back on the choppy water, Cadet Miller was reaching the peak of his power trip. His thorough inspection had yielded nothing more than a few trivial fixable squabbles, not nearly enough to justify his aggressive stance. Frustrated by Silas's infuriating calm and the lack of a genuine infraction, Miller decided to create one. "All right, that's it," he announced, stepping out of the wheelhouse. "Given your non-compliant attitude, your inability to follow simple instructions, and the generally unsafe condition of this vessel, I'm making a command decision." He puffed out his chest, looking back at his lieutenant for approval, and receiving a slight permissive nod. "This vessel is a public menace. We're impounding it. And you, sir," he said, turning his full attention to Silas, "are coming with us. We'll have you evaluated by a medical professional. Maybe you're not fit to be operating a boat anymore." It was the ultimate insult, a dagger of condescension aimed at the heart of the old man's pride and autonomy. Miller took a step forward and reached out, his hand open, intending to grab Silas's arm and lead him away like a lost child. It was the final arrogant overreach, the one that pushed him far past the point of redemption. Just as his fingers were about to close on Silas's worn sleeve, a new sound split the air. It wasn't the chug of the Wanderer's engine or the drone of the cutter. It was the high-throated roar of powerful twin engines at full throttle. Everyone, Miller, the lieutenant, the crowd on the pier turned toward the sound. 2 sleek, gray Navy patrol boats were slicing through the channel, leaving wide white wakes behind them. Their blue lights were flashing, and they were closing the distance with breathtaking speed. They moved with an aggressive precision that made the Coast Guard cutter suddenly look sluggish and civilian. Simultaneously, on the pier, a black command car with government plates and small official flags mounted on its front fenders screeched to a halt, and several sailors in immaculate dress white uniforms disembarked, forming a stoic, silent line at the water's edge. The spectacle was overwhelming, a sudden and shocking display of military authority. The Coast Guard crew stared, mouths agape. This was not a response to a minor channel violation. This was the kind of response reserved for a security threat, for a visiting dignitary, for something of immense importance. The lead patrol boat, a Mark VI bristling with antennae and purpose, slowed expertly, its engines dropping to a low growl as it pulled alongside the Wanderer, effectively shielding the small fishing boat from the cutter. On its deck stood Captain Eva Rostova, her uniform pristine, her expression a cold, hard mask of fury. She didn't even glance at the Coast Guard vessel. Her eyes, burning with an intensity that could melt steel, were fixed solely on Silas Croft. As the patrol boat came to a complete stop, its bow inches from the Wanderer's stern, Captain Rostova snapped her heels together. Her back went ramrod straight. She raised her right hand to the brim of her combination cover in the sharpest, most flawlessly executed salute of her career. The gesture was not perfunctory. It was an act of profound, almost reverent respect. "Captain Croft, sir," she boomed, her voice carrying across the water with absolute clarity, amplified by the sudden shocked silence. "On behalf of the United States Navy, I deeply apologize for this disturbance." The word hung in the air, a stun grenade that detonated in Cadet Miller's mind. "Captain." He looked from the powerful, decorated female officer on the patrol boat to the stooped, white-haired old man in the stained fishing vest. It was impossible. It made no sense. Captain Rostova held her salute, her eyes locked on Silas. Slowly, as if recalling a movement from a lifetime ago, Silas raised his own hand in a weary but perfectly correct return salute. Rostova lowered her hand and turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the dumbfounded Coast Guard crew and the bewildered crowd on the pier. "For the benefit of those unaware," she announced, her voice ringing with cold, instructional fury, "you are in the presence of Captain Silas Croft, United States Navy, retired." She took a breath, her voice rising in volume and power with each word. "You are in the presence of the man who as a lieutenant commander served as the executive officer of the USS Starkweather. During a patrol in the Persian Gulf in 1987, his ship was struck by 2 Exocet missiles. With the captain incapacitated and the bridge on fire, then Commander Croft took command. Despite suffering severe burns and shrapnel wounds, he organized the damage control teams, directed the firefighting efforts from a smoke-filled passageway, and when the helm was destroyed, he personally rigged a manual rudder from the aft steering compartment. Every word was a hammer blow, dismantling Miller's reality piece by piece. On the cutter, the lieutenant's face had gone pale. With his ship burning and dead in the water in a hostile minefield, Rostova continued, her voice now a roar of righteous vindication. Commander Croft navigated for 6 hours using nothing but a magnetic compass and celestial observation, guiding his crippled ship and its surviving crew through the mines to safe waters. His actions that day saved the lives of 188 American sailors. She paused, then pointed a rigid finger toward the Wanderer's wheelhouse. The piece of scrap metal that your cadet so professionally identified as a safety hazard is a fragment of the missile that struck his ship's combat information center. He keeps it as a reminder. Captain Silas Croft is a recipient of the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat. He is not a confused old man. He is a hero of this nation, and he has earned the right to fish wherever the hell he pleases. A stunned silence fell over the water, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves. Then from the pier, a single person began to clap. The sound was joined by another, then another, until the air was filled with a thunderous rolling ovation. The tourists, the locals, Chief Peterson with tears streaming down his face. They were all applauding, not just for the story, but for the man who had lived it, the unassuming hero in their midst. Captain Rostova finally turned her glacial gaze upon the Coast Guard lieutenant, who now looked as if he wanted the sea to open up and swallow him. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "your cadet has in the course of one afternoon managed to disrespect a living legend, question his fitness, insult his character, and attempt to seize the property of a Navy Cross recipient. This constitutes an institutional failure of the highest order. It will be addressed at the highest levels. See to it that your command is prepared to explain how this happened. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Captain," the lieutenant stammered, his face ashen. Cadet Miller stood frozen, his world utterly shattered. The man he had called Grandpa and a menace was a giant. He, Miller, was less than nothing. Just then, Silas raised a hand, his palm open. "Captain," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "There's no need for all that." All eyes turned to him. "The boy, the cadet," Silas began, looking at Miller not with anger, but with something akin to pity. "He was just doing his job, a little, eagerly maybe. He's young. We were all young once, weren't we? Full of regulations and short on perspective." He looked from Miller to Rostova. "The sea teaches its own lessons. Looks like today was his first real one. Let it be enough." The grace of the gesture was the final, crushing blow to Miller's arrogance. It was a lesson in humility delivered by the very man he had tried to humiliate. As Silas spoke of youth and lessons learned, the world flickered again. For a brief searing moment, we are back on the bridge of the burning Starkweather. A much younger Silas, his face black with soot, his uniform torn and stained with blood, stands over a fallen crewman. The air is thick with smoke and the smell of death. His eyes fall upon the jagged hole in the bulkhead where the missile punched through. Embedded in the twisted steel is the fragment, still radiating a faint heat. Later, after the fires are out and a semblance of order has been restored, we see him, alone, carefully prying the shard loose with a crowbar. He doesn't hold it like a trophy. He holds it like a burden, a heavy piece of memory, a physical reminder of the price of survival and the cost of command. Weeks later, the fallout was both swift and meaningful. Cadet Miller was not expelled, but he was remanded to the most basic duties at the academy, spending his days swabbing decks and polishing brass, given ample time to reflect on the difference between authority and respect. More significantly, at Captain Rostova's firm insistence, the Coast Guard Academy instituted a new mandatory training module for all cadets. Developed in partnership with the Navy, it was called the Veteran Protocol, and its primary case study was the official report on the Silas Croft incident. The first slide of the presentation was a picture of the Wanderer, with the simple caption, "Legends don't always wear uniforms." One afternoon, a formal apology, handwritten and signed by the Commandant of the Coast Guard himself, was delivered to Silas's small, neat home by a nervous ensign. Silas read it, nodded, and placed it in a drawer without ceremony. The true epilogue came a month after the incident. Silas was at the local bait and tackle shop, buying a small bag of frozen shrimp. The door opened and a young man in civilian clothes entered, hesitating just inside the doorway. It was Miller. He looked thinner, his face etched with a newfound humility. He approached the old fisherman cautiously. "Sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Croft. Captain Croft, sir." Silas turned, his pale blue eyes regarding the young man without malice. I wanted to apologize," Miller stammered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "In person. There's no excuse for how I acted, for what I said. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I'm sorry, truly sorry." Silas studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod of acceptance. He paid for his shrimp and turned to leave. At the door he paused and looked back at Miller. "Respect the sea, son," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. "And respect the people who've sailed it longer than you've been alive. You do that," he added, a flicker of something like a smile touching his lips, "and you'll be a fine officer one day." He placed a gentle hand on Miller's shoulder for a brief moment, a gesture of absolution, then walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving the young man alone in the quiet shop with the profound and lasting weight of a lesson learned the hard way. If you were moved by this story of unassuming courage, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories for more tales of the heroes who walk among us.